Okay, so last week I kind of gave a bit of background just to remind us, of who Buddha is and where he's come from, and coming from this amazing tradition that existed, fully developed India, amazing system of philosophy and psychology and metaphysics and spirituality. Buddha came out of that tradition and then moved in his own direction. Didn't chuck out necessarily what he'd heard. He went as far as he could, and then he went further, he would suggest. And he went further in relation, in particular, to it's the potential of the human being. Our potential. What's our potential? So the whole idea is to lessen, from the Buddhist point of view of the mind, as we discussed, is to become super familiar with our own minds. That's why you meditate. That's why you learn to get concentration. To become super familiar with your mind so you can unpack and unravel its contents. Because it's infinitely flexible, this mind of ours. And so, of course, as we've discussed, we're not discussing the brain. We're discussing the cognitive process itself, which for the Buddha is this very personal thing, We talked a bit about how we talked about how the mind, as far as Buddha is concerned, the mind is not physical. The mind has got this far more subtle levels of cognition. This is a crucial thing to take as a view in order to understand what Buddha is saying we can accomplish. Because if we take the view that the mind is the brain, then Buddhism is a load of nonsense, a complete load of nonsense. It's just science fiction, So, and that's what we think about religion. But the Buddhist view is he's describing what's possible. He's describing his own experiences. So the key thing then is the essence of being a Buddhist, and therefore the understanding we have to have is about how the mind works. This is fundamental, I mean, being a Buddhist, the bottom line of being a Buddhist, it almost seems too simplistic, but the bottom line of being a Buddhist is not, looking like this 14th century Tibetan, not having a bald head, not living in vows, not even being ethical. That's not the essence of being a Buddhist. That's common to any good human being. A good communist would be ethical, That's nothing special. But the essence of being a Buddhist is to do with the mind. The crucial point is that Buddha's saying that we have the power to become familiar with our mind, and then on the basis of why we become familiar is so we can do this one key job of distinguishing between the neurotic, deluded, I-based, fear-based, unhappy states of mind, and the positive, valid, reasonable, appropriate, virtuous states of mind. That's the bottom line. That's being a Buddhist. That's it. And and on the basis of becoming familiar with it, you don't just sit there and become familiar with it. Like when you learn botany, you learn all about weeds and flowers, and you need to know the difference. It's crucial, isn't it? You've got to know the difference. But you don't just sit there and say, there's the difference, and leave it there. What's the action? This is the point. Well, you pull out the weeds and you grow the flowers, don't you? The same with the mind. This is the bottom line. That we've got this, Buddha's view is we've got this extraordinary potential to be rid of all the rubbish in the mind. And this is a pretty radical concept. I mean, it's a bizarre concept in the West. There's no view that you can take out bits of your brain, because we're talking about the brain in the West, right? So we factor in as a normal part of a normal person, so normal that you would be abnormal if you didn't have them. A bit of anger, a bit of love, a bit of jealousy, a bit of depression, a bit of intelligence, hopefully more of the nice stuff. We're hoping that. And even now we do, we're starting to realize in the West we're not stuck with the brain we're born with, so it's kind of encouraging. But that's exactly and precisely Buddha's point. That's his one key thing. You become a Buddhist when you start to do that job. You can wear robes until the cows come home. You can have a nice bald head, live in vows, wonderful. That's not being a Buddhist. That's not the essence of it. The actual job, which is based on Buddha's, really intricate, clear experience about the mind, the way the mind works. And where does he get that from? Not from putting a microscope on the brain. No, putting your own microscope of your own mind on your own mind itself. That's quite unique to the Buddha. There's no view like that. We don't trust that kind of level of subjectivity in the West. We think it's kind of a bit suspicious, But that's the Buddha's view. And so as we talk, this word Buddha tells us everything. The end result of this entire job is, Buddha, rid of all the rubbish, full of all the goodness, the etymology of those two syllables. It's a very powerful concept. It should blow our minds. Okay, it might take a while to get to that result, but what it implies is you're not set in stone. And that we know that term, not set in stone, it's very powerful. Our mothers would tell us. Which means you can change your mind. And the simple question is, why would I want to change my mind? Why would I want to? Because the neurotic states of mind are cause of my misery, and the cause of why I make a mess of my life. And who wants that? And the longer term for Buddha, with his view of continuity of consciousness coming from a previous life and going to another one, is that you bring your stuff with you. So who wants suffering, you know? I mean, he says we're our own boss. Dalai Lama calls karma, this law of karma, self-creation. That's a really powerful concept. So instead of this view that I'm an innocent victim and got plonked on this planet by a creator or by mum and dad, they're the two options, aren't they? And in each case, in that one case, there's the agreement that you're made by someone else. I mean, the more you look into the Buddha's views, the more nutty that idea is. And that's not being rude. Well, I probably am being rude, but it's okay. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm not trying to be, you know, that's Buddha's view. It's his observation. So it's worth looking into. And I mean, that's what I found the most powerful. When I first heard these teachings, like when I was 31 or something, you know, a few years ago, that's the word. I remember I couldn't understand 90% of what Lama Zopa was saying. It was so arcane and medieval. But that one was, that's the one, this view of karma. I mean, even the word somehow triggered something when I started to understand what it meant. That I bring my own stuff with me and I create my own reality. I mean, this is incredible. And even just beginning to take the view of karma, which is not an easy one for modern people, because we just think it's superstition, you know. But even beginning to hear theoretically the view of karma, that you know, what I think and do and say produces the person I become. It's kind of very powerful. You start becoming less of a victim. This is the point. You start becoming more accountable, more courageous, you know. So there's, in the beginning stages of practice, like I use this analogy that a bird needs two wings, wisdom and compassion. It's a way of framing the entirety of the path to enlightenment, you know, it really is. The nuts and bolts of all Buddha's teachings about the universe, about how it works, and about the mind, that's all the wisdom wing. That's the nuts and bolts of the stuff that we have to use ourselves to unpack and unravel our own mind and start to change ourselves. So let's just look a bit at that. Because in order to understand just our day-to-day lives, why we get fear, why we freak out, why when things go bad we have panic attacks and get miserable and get depressed and think, oh my God, I can't cope with it. You know, what are the workings of the mind as far as Buddha's concerned that underpin all of that? Well, it almost seems simple. It seems simplistic. And we make it so complex, may I suggest, in our modern psychological views, you know. The essence of it is understanding the three main delusions. Buddha refers to them as the three poisons. Everybody who reads Buddhism, you're going to read about the three poisons. Well, you know, there's this kind of elaborate view of the mind as far as Buddha is concerned. Apparently there's like 84,000 distinct neurotic states of mind. Like they've mapped the mind, basically, you know. And then, of course, there are the antidotes, the 84,000 positive states of mind that are the ones that counteract. But they all subsume to three, because it's a really elaborate, clear, coherent map. Actually, I keep asking these geshis what text the map is in, and they never know. So, I mean, but Buddha always does talk about 84,000 delusions. It has to be there somewhere. So it's interesting. There's this elaborate kind of, this elaborate map. And I remember Ling Rinpoche, some of you for sure in India, the young Ling Rinpoche, the reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's root guru. And he's based in, as you know, he was based in Dharamsala. Now he's don't know where he's based now. Anyway, he travels a bit, teaches around the West, and I remember seeing him in 2 different places. And 2 different times I heard him say this particular thing, which I'd never heard anywhere else, and other people tell me they haven't heard it either. It's interesting. He said all these 84,000 states of mind, the neurotic ones, they all subsume to these 3. And we'll go into those 3. Or I'll say them now, but we'll go into them, because these are the ones to understand. If you want to understand your mind, and you want to understand everybody else's mind, and you want to know how to get less fear, less neurotic, more courageous, you've got to understand these 3. They're primordially deep, and they're massive in their understanding. It's necessary. So, okay, all of these, 21,000 of these 84,000 are rooted in the root delusion called ignorance. 21,000 are rooted in attachment, and 21,000 are rooted in aversion or anger, and the other 21,000 are rooted in all 3. So it's a really coherent view of the mind. And again, remember, we're not talking about mapping the mind, the brain. I remember a few years ago, I remember hearing that His Holiness the Dalai Lama offered, from his money he gets from people's offerings, he offered $750,000 to this particular lot of neuroscientists to help them map the mind. I thought it was so humble of him. He's got a map already. He's done the job, you know, but out of kindness, because he's communicating with the Western world, the outside, the people who talk about the brain. He's amazing, you know. So how kind of him to do that. But he's got the mind. They've mapped it 3,000 years ago, these, you know, genius Indians before the Buddha did it. So let's look at these three, because they sound so cute. When you read it, you read the books, the three poisons. You don't go to your therapist, I've got the three poisons. They'll tell you, shut up and go home, Wait till you want to kill your husband or something before you start to go to therapists. But these are the point. This is Buddha's entire point. If we can learn to see these three states of mind before they become rampant. That's our problem in our culture. We wait till you want to kill somebody or yourself before you start to look at your mind. In fact, we feel bad about going to a therapist. It's only when you're really seriously having a problem that we think of going to a therapist. But what about maintenance? What about preventative? We have it for the body. We're brilliant for the body. We have amazing preventative methods, but we do not have it for the mind. We don't pay attention until the wheels are falling off. This is really 90% of why we have such problems, because we leave it till too late, So then the Buddhist approach is, and we can start to understand our mind when we're little and start working with it, then you'd never have mental breakdowns. You'd never get anxiety attacks. And this is not a joke. This is true. Because the key factor that determines your happiness and suffering in day to day, the key factor is what goes on in your mind. But we're obsessed with thinking it's everything out there, and it's so complex, It's not. They're the secondary things. They're the catalysts. They're merely the catalysts. So even understanding this concept, that what goes on in your mind is the main player and the outside world are like the triggers. But we think it's literally the opposite. I'm this innocent victim that has got no control, and things happen and they're the main cause, and that's why I experience what I experience. It's the literal opposite for the Buddha. So this itself is a revelation, if we can even begin to contemplate it, the possibility of it, and then learn to know our minds. Not just read the books and go, oh yeah, I'm a Buddhist, I've got the three poisons, oh yeah, wow. Who cares? You've got to understand it. It's not enough to say that there's botany. Yeah, I like botany. Yeah, botany works. Well, how does it work? Oh, I don't know. What good is that? You've got to know, you've got to unpack and unravel these things. And this just takes time. Lama Yeshe said, I can tell you about attachment for one whole year. We'll never begin to understand what's going on until we start working deeply in our mind. And you can't fast track that. You can only know your own mind as fast as you can know it. You can't do more. You've got to learn from your experience. Start with the theories. You can just learn pretty quickly. You start with the theories, the words, and then you start looking inside. So already that's so difficult, because we'd rather look on the outside. That seems to be what is evident to us straight away. The boyfriend does that thing. He's the mean person. That's why I'm angry. Until we change that one and start saying, okay, my business is the anger. Let's look at it. This is really hard. It's like reversing the energy of a bomb, It's intense. You have to want to do that. You have to be convinced that that is the thing you can change. So that's the thing you better become familiar with. So the two to understand. Okay, the root delusion. These three have got a hierarchical relationship. They're intimately, utterly connected. And the root one. Okay, let's first look at the words that are used to refer to these states of mind. The Buddha's view, like I've mentioned, we did briefly last week, I think I'll say it again now, when we start to look at the actual psychological model of the mind. There's two. You can look at you look at the way the mind functions, the epistemological model, and then you look at the psychological model, which is the contents of our thoughts and feelings and emotions. So Buddha divides very simply into three categories, which itself seems almost bizarre to us. There's nothing like that in psychiatry. Three categories precisely, into which everything you think and feel fits. This is pretty incredible. The first lot are the neurotic, deluded, disturbing, fear-based, and necessarily I-based states of mind. The cause of suffering, the main cause, and the cause of suffering and the cause of, therefore, why we make a mess of the world, why we harm each other. Look at the world, Second lot, they're the valid ones: reasonable, virtuous, appropriate, productive, useful. The source of to the extent to which they prevail in our mind, the source of our happiness, and therefore the source of our ability to be of use to the world. I mean, this is really the essence of it. The third lot, they call them this positive, negative, and neutral. Neutral sounds is misleading to us. It means like they don't matter. No. I'd rather call them the mechanics of our mind. In other words, they're states of mind that, using this view of negative and positive, and I'm going to try and describe that, these are neither negative nor positive, but they're totally necessary states of mind. The mechanics, meaning whether you're a murderer or a meditator, whether you're a psychopath or a saint, you need good concentration. You've got concentration, intention, attention, discrimination. There's many of these. They don't have the character of being virtuous, nor do they have the character of being non-virtuous, which means we need to understand these meanings. When we hear negative, positive, virtuous, non-virtuous, you get a bit nervous, you know? And in psychology, we don't like using terms like that. It sounds judgmental. But it's got a very distinct flavor for the Buddha. So there's these three categories, that's it. So forget the mechanics of them. The mechanics of our mind, they're developed in concentration. They really make our mind super sharp and super clear. So if you're the best sniper on the planet, you've got really good concentration. You've got really good mindfulness. You've got really good intention. You've got really good attention. You've got really good discrimination. They all have a really key role in making you precise and exact in killing the right person every time. Now, if you're a meditator, exactly the same. And you're a practitioner, then all of these need to be really honed and really refined, because they enable you to do the job of distinguishing between the neurotic and ones and the valid ones. They're the parts that make you capable. So, okay, so what is it about negative states of mind? And what is it about positives? The Buddha even calls them this, you know. And how do they function? When we hear words like anger, attachment, maybe attachment, not so sure, because we don't really use it in the same way as Buddha does, but we need to understand it. It's fundamental in Buddhism. Jealousy, anxiety, arrogance, low self-esteem, depression. We are intimately familiar with these, and each of us has got our own kind of experience of them. But in one thing we would say about all of them is we'd say that they're emotions. They're emotions. And that means when we feel them strongly, our body is very involved. In fact, we're so addicted to our body that this is part of our problem. We don't notice what goes on in our mind until our body's involved, which is when the wheels are falling off, which is when it's extreme. Because we think of them as emotions, and we think of them physically. So that's why we never pay attention. That's why we don't notice what's happening in our mind. Tibetans like to point here for the mind. We don't notice what's going on in our mind until it's too late. I can't stress this point enough. So, you know, somebody might, you know, I'm a kind of person, since a little girl, I was good at anger. You know, I'd shout and yell. It was evident Robina was angry. You can see her shouting and yelling, you know, clenching her little fists. But lots of people don't do that. So you would always say, I don't have anger. But that's just not true. You do, but it's more. It's a milder level of it. It's a milder level of anger. So what's the key? The word that is the one that is the most is just the bare bones state of mind that anger is an expression of, is called aversion. So attachment and aversion. So the root delusion. So first of all, the root delusion. The root of these three. The root one, the most primordial, the most fundamental one, is just literally called ignorance, ma-rigpa in Tibetan. And it's the main cause of suffering, such that when you have uprooted it, which is when you've quote unquote realized emptiness, and we'll talk about this, that's when you're climbing out of samsara into your nirvana. You've got more work to do, but you can't go back after that. That's the crucial one. And all the work as a Buddhist, in this packaging of the Buddha's teachings, it's leading us inexorably to our ability to realize emptiness and then cut the root of samsara. Everything's all logically, organically, incrementally presented, you know, in terms of the capability of the disciple. So in the middle scope of teachings, like I call high school, where you learn to become your own therapist, you learn about your mind in great depth. You know, you're not emphasizing so much there dealing with ignorance, but you're learning to do the two branch delusions. You're really learning to really understand attachment, and then the response when attachment doesn't get what it wants, which is called aversion. So these two, attachment and aversion, these are the crucial ones we have to understand. Once we understand these, all the rest, the 84,000 coming from all these, that come down to these, we'll be able to understand them. It's a really intricate way of seeing the mind. It's very fascinating. And we're not describing the brain. We are describing the actual cognitive, subjective, experiential process itself of our thoughts and feelings and emotions. So the crucial thing is this. Well, they're always crucial, all of them. We wait until we, like I'm saying, we wait until the body is involved. That's why a person like me, it's easy to see I've got a problem. Shouting and yelling, the words coming out the mouth, spit coming out the mouth, eyes wide, irrational words, stomping, having a mental breakdown, basically, Oh, look at that. She's angry, we'll say. But another person, one of my sisters, let's say, is quiet, never raised her voice. Oh, no, she's not angry. But we've both, the point is, so anger, which is a response when attachment doesn't get what it wants, and we've got to go into attachment. Anger is got a whole spectrum of responses. So the most volatile, obvious expression of aversion. Aversion is when attachment doesn't get what it wants. Attachment's the junkie that runs everything. We'll get to that. But the second attachment is thwarted. The second attachment doesn't get what it wants. And it's 1,000 times a day, I promise. That's what's called aversion. So aversion's got a whole spectrum. The most volatile, obvious, shouting in your face expression of aversion is anger. So that, but that's what we think is a problem. Now, what are the mild aversions? When something doesn't go right, when you drop the cup while you're washing the dishes, when you hear the sound that's slightly too loud, when the person doesn't answer you properly, when the person bumps into you in the street, when you just sort of car gets a bit close to you, when 1,000 times a day something will happen, when you're not getting what you want, you'll be annoyed, you'll be irritated, you'll be frustrated, you'll get upset. They are literally anger, but they're milder versions. But we just think they're normal. And when we say normal, we mean you just take them for granted. That's not a problem. It's just normal. Of course you get upset if you break a cup. Of course you get upset if your husband looks at you wrong. We say it like that. So we defend our right to have it. And therefore we incorporate it into normalcy. But the point is, one of the crucial things that Buddha says about the mind, which is really fascinating, there's nothing we ever think or see or hear or say or touch or smell or feel that goes astray. Everything is stored in the mind. I remember Geshe Tashi in London saying it's like we're shooting a movie all day and everything gets stored. Everything gets stored. So we're building, things build up, So in one day, suddenly nothing goes right. The things are wrong, the car breaks down, the husband's irritating, you break the cup doing your washing, the dishes. You're not a person who shouts and yells. But what happens? You get annoyed, irritated, upset, you get worried, anxious. These words are and they're all variations of aversion. And then to understand what aversion is, you've got to understand what attachment is, because aversion is the response when attachment doesn't get what it wants. And this is the normal, ordinary level of it. So it's the kind of person who gets annoyed and frustrated. One day there'll be one action that'll be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and then either you'll kill your husband or you'll kill yourself. Big surprise to everybody. You never saw it coming, because we never pay attention to this mind until it's vomiting out the mouth, or until you're inert in bed and unable to get up because of depression after 27 years. It's too late then, but we don't pay attention. That's the tragedy. That's the tragedy. That's why we have so much so-called, Buddha's saying we're all mentally ill, and I don't say that sarcastically. I say it literally. It's just that our view of mental illness is on the outer spectrum, Normal is irritated, annoyed, upset, frustrated, depressed, anxious. That's normal. We don't think that's mentally ill. But Buddha says having any attachment, any aversion, anything, any of these delusions, by definition, you are mentally ill. In fact, the words in Sanskrit, it's very interesting. The word that's used most commonly, and as we know, and from the Tibetan translation as well, and in English, the word that's most common in the literature for the unhappy states of mind, the neurotic states of mind, is the word klesha. And it's translated as affliction. Well, it's a very nice word. Look in the dictionary. It's a very good word, but who uses it? Who uses it? Nobody. It's medieval. Well, old-fashioned anyway, maybe Victorian. I mean, think about it. Who says, I have an affliction today? But bloody Buddhists do. Excuse me. Americans got so upset when I said bloody once. I said it's normal words in English. Don't worry about it. Australians and English say bloody. Maybe you Poms don't, but we Australians do. I mean, it's like, an affliction. It's just an absurd word. And I know Lama Yeshe, who's he met Westerners in the 60s and early 70s. It was like Lama was born a hippie. He was incredible. He just somehow knew how he talked. And I saw him when I'm editing his teachings in his Mahamudra book, this wonderful book of Lamas came out last year. I identified 21 different synonyms that Lama has made up to try and get us to understand what an affliction is, And he never uses the word affliction. He just knows it's ridiculous. I mean, it's not ridiculous. His Holiness uses it, excuse me. But we don't use it in daily life. So what are the characteristics of these unhappy states of mind? We have to understand this to know how to identify them. Well, there's two main functions. Two precisely. One is, and this is a synonym often used, disturbing emotion. Disturbing emotion. And this is the thing when we're in the high school level, medium scope, we're looking at the mind and trying to understand our mind. That's the one we're trying to identify. And this, if we could really identify the disturbingness of just having attachment, anger, depression, jealousy, low self-esteem, that it's unbearably painful. Now, we know it's painful, we know it's disturbing, but the logic we use is, well, it's not my fault. What can I do? It's my boyfriend's fault. So we have all this incredible blame and self-pity view about it. Of course it's disturbing, and guess whose fault it is? But the Buddha's saying if we could really realize how disturbing it is and knowing I can change it, this should be enough to never want to be angry again. But we're so disconnected from our own experiences and so caught up in this victim mentality, and with respect, we just love to blame, and that's how we describe in our culture. Who caused it? The boyfriend. Buddha says, yeah, he was a creep. I agree with you. But he's even got explanations for why that happens, and that's karma. But leave that one for now. If we could just get in touch with the pain of the depression, the jealousy, we are in touch with it, but we've got a wrong analysis, Buddha suggests, which means we stay stuck in it, and then we feel we have a right. But I'm allowed to be angry, we'll say. That's how we talk. This is a nightmare, you know. So disturbing emotion disturbing is one characteristic, the key one. The other one, which is more subtle, and it gets to the bones of how these disturbing emotions function. And when we get this point, this gives us the basis for being able to unpack and unravel and rid the mind of them. Until we understand this one, we can't even think how can it's possible to get rid of a disturbing emotion, you know, not possible. So this is the word delusion. So I notice in other languages, when I go around, people translate for me, Italian and Spanish and other languages, they don't have a proper word for this. It is in Spanish, for example, but it's very arcane. It's like you don't use it. But it's the absolutely perfect word for understanding exactly the way these delusions function, these neurotic states of mind, and therefore why we suffer, but crucially, therefore showing us how we can change them. We've got to understand this one. This is the crucial one. So, you know, let's just talk about this one. So the word is delusion. So the first lot, these negative states of mind, disturbing emotions, delusions, afflictions, all these synonyms, you know. Excuse me, I have to blow my nose, I'm so sorry. So we've got the three root delusions. The root delusion, ignorance, mahripa, and it's colloquially, when it refers to the self, we can call it ego grasping. It's very tasty. Then on the basis of that, roughly speaking, it's the function of ego grasping, this root delusion. It believes utterly and completely and without question in a separate, bereft, kind of pathetic me, concrete and utterly in the nature of fear. You can almost argue that this ego grasping is a bit like what Mr. Darwin identified as instinct for survival. It's like a sleeping lion most of the time. But when you get attacked, offended, insulted, it rises up and this utter panic and fear comes. I did not do that. How dare you do that to me? That's the one. It's there, and it underpins attachment, aversion, and the other 83,997. It's the root for this reason. It's primordially deep, and we don't really get into this one until we've gotten to the Bodhisattva path, when we look at the 6 perfections, and we look at the 6th one, which is where we look at the wisdom that understands how that I does not exist, the fantasy. So on the basis of this ego grasping, this sense of a separate self, concrete, set in stone, then there is this, that effectively, as far as the Four Noble Truths are concerned, the main cause of all suffering in daily life. And that's called attachment. This simple, cute, ridiculous word, you know. And of course, we use it in our language, but we use it in our culture. She's very attached to her children. That's a good quality. We kind of conflate it with love and kindness. Nothing wrong, but that's not Buddha's definition. And that's why, because we conflate it with good quality, we assume it's the same. Then that's why, as Lama Zopa says sometimes, when we hear that we've got to give up attachment, we go, oh, I've got to give up my happiness. I've got to give up my heart. Because we don't have a clear definition. We have our definition, that's fine. But if Buddha's saying it, a particular thing, we better know what he means by it. It's very precise. And this is something surprising to us. In psychology, I think in Western psychology, there's about 1 million different systems. And every day someone comes up with a new idea and we think it's fine. But there's no precision, there's no real clarity, there's no real communication, there's no real agreement on definitions. But in the Buddha's view, it's absolutely crystal clear. The clarity and precision and depth of analysis that we know we need for math and even to make a cake is exactly what we need in order to understand our mind. So we have to start learning the definition. That's why you start learning that text called Lorig. Highly technical, fascinating, clear presentation of what the mind is and how it functions. It's extraordinary. You've got to learn that first. Then you start using those names and you start seeing inside by using those words. I use the example of botany. You can look at a garden for 1,000 years. You can even replicate the garden because you see it all. This lovely pink there and a blue there and a green there. And you can even do a lovely drawing of it. But if you don't know botany, what's the point? If you can't know what you're looking at, if you can't say that's a rose and know what to do with a rose, if you can't say that's what a weed is and know what to do with a weed, what's the point? What's the point, Same with your mind. So we recognize anger and depression, but only when there's severe, extreme emotional levels, when we feel it through our body, because we're so addicted to our body. As Lama Yeshe says, we make the body the boss. We only think we're the body in our culture. But Buddha's view is this mind of ours is not physical and it's got these subtler levels. So even at the conceptual level, the gross daily level, we can still go to see the mind before it becomes emotional. That's the key to success. So to understand them is crucial. So the ego grasping, this primordial sense of a separate me, on the basis and it's fear-based. This is what's fascinating. It's utterly fear-based. All these delusions are fear-based. This is so fascinating. So then it gives rise to attachment. And this attachment, again, it's multifaceted. It's got a whole spectrum. The most primordial level of attachment, the most primordial energy of attachment, it's called dissatisfaction. And why are we we get born with this. Mummy didn't teach us. We don't have dissatisfaction because Mummy didn't give us what we wanted. No. Because whatever you got from your mummy, you were never satisfied because you got dissatisfaction already. And that's from having practiced attachment in the past. And when we understand attachment, that it's a bottomless pit, and as my mother used to say about food, when I was little, I was into my food, the more you get, the more you want. That's the key suffering of attachment. So when you understand that, we'll go into it, then you understand why dissatisfaction comes. Because the more look at a junkie. They're not getting satisfied as they get more junkie. You get more miserable. You get more junkie. So dissatisfaction is the result of practicing attachment, which is the bottomless pit. So dissatisfaction is the primordial energy. And then the next aspect, so because you're dissatisfied, naturally what that is feeling there's a hole in here, that I'm missing something. I'm missing something, or I am not enough, or I don't have enough. And no matter how much my boyfriend tells me he loves me, it's not enough. How much food I get, it's not enough. How much junk I get, it's not enough. How many boys I jump on in a day, it's not enough. It's a bottomless pit of dissatisfaction. So because you're dissatisfied, naturally, where do you look for the things to fill up the gaping hole? The outside world, the objects of attachment. Effectively, this entire universe is the objects of the five senses. Think about it. And that's what we're addicted to. That's what attachment looks at all day, looking like a vampire for something out there, depending on your karma, such that when you get it, it'll fill up the gaping hole. That's the emotional hunger. The dissatisfaction which gives rise to this emotional hunger, this craving, this constant looking. And so then looking and then manipulating and controlling to get it. We're brilliant when it comes to getting what we want. And then the holding, and then the crucial, the heart job of attachment is when it gets, either before you get it and what causes you to go get it, let's say it's the boy. The idea of the boy is so over exaggerated. It's like demented, like insane. The exaggeration that attachment dumps on the idea of the boy, that divine, perfect, in heaven, and exaggerates also his function in his role for my happiness. It's his job to make me happy. It's the cake's job to make me happy. So attachment over exaggerates grotesquely, depending on how strong attachment is, the deliciousness of the cake, the boy, the handbag, the thing, whatever it might be. And then and then the believing, utterly everything is leading to this, that when I get it, that'll be the happiness, that'll bring the satisfaction. And then, of course, it's the possessing of it. It becomes an extension of you. This is all, control freak, expectations, all of these words we know so well. Emotional hunger, neediness, she's so needy. All of these are variations of the word and of the function of attachment. Attachment also has the function of the mind being out of control, berserk, never stopping, uncontrolled thinking, all perky and excited and over-exaggerating. So we're literally living in la-la land all day. And this is what Buddha means by mental illness. So the word klesha, I really think a really good translation of it. Affliction. Look at affliction. Affliction is a problem. Well, attachment is a problem. So you've got a headache, which is a problem, and then you have attachment, which is the mind. So one is a physical problem and one is a mental problem. Well, what's called a mental problem? It's called a mental illness. But it's such a shocking concept for us. To hear that you're mentally ill, you feel horrified. You want to hide it straight away. But I'm not joking. When you hear what Buddha's saying, he's saying we're all mentally ill. But it's so shocking to hear it this way. We can't really hear it properly. Because we think Buddha's sort of this funny little thing over here and got these strange afflictions and it's sort of different, Real problems are called bipolar and OBD and ACD and AHDH and OCD and whatever they all are. But attachment, that's Buddha's thing, We're very weird. It's just his words. When you understand OCD, that's attachment, gone berserk in the head, uncontrolled crazy thoughts. When you understand ADHD, that's attachment, out of control, uncontrolled thoughts. When you understand bipolar, I'm not joking now. I'm really not joking. I'm not trying to be sort of clever. Buddha's got this profound understanding of the mind. It's been around for 3,000 years. I'm not trying to say so. I'm not trying to be elitist or anything. But it's all understood. It's all there. But we just don't hear it when we hear these words. Most Buddhists, they think they've got mental problems. They go to a therapist and I've got OCD, they'll say. Then what about attachment? I don't know. We don't even use Buddha's view to understand our minds. We just think it's religion, It's very weird. So, these disturbing emotions, these delusions, so why are they a delusion? That's the key. I've already indicated it. So what's delusion? You know yourself when you are accused of being delusional. We use it very much in psychological terms, don't we? You are not in touch with reality. That's exactly the point. Well, that's exactly the point the Buddha is saying. But it's because we so take it for granted. So when I describe attachment for cake, we will all recognize it, whatever the object might be, The object can change, doesn't matter. It's the function of the attachment. Attachment, the cake, the cake that's on the plate that my attachment sees is not the cake on the plate. It's a projection. It's a made-up story, a distorted, exaggerated description. There is a cake there. We agree it's a chocolate cake. It's not a carrot cake. We agree it's chocolate cake. We agree it's a triangle. We agree it's even a well-made chocolate cake. Tick all the boxes. That's valid. But the cake that I see when it's seen through the filter, through the lenses of my attachment, that means to say my emotional hunger, and because of some connection, it's chocolate cake that does it for me. I've got this emotional hunger. I'm missing something. I'm looking out there. Where is it? And I think, oh, cake, bullseye, get it, jump out, go get it. And you're anticipating, you're expecting, you're imagining it, you see it, you order it, it's on the plate, and you build up all this excitement, all this anticipation. You can't wait. And it's just all instinctive. And that's the process we have to become familiar with. That's the process, because every second there's 1,000 little thoughts going on in there. We don't see them as thoughts. We just see them as feelings. And there's these exaggerated, elaborate, set in stone descriptions in my mind of exactly what that cake is and exactly what that cake's going to do for me when I put it in the mouth. And then all the expectation that comes. And then the whole process of the terrible disappointment as it starts to go downhill after the first mouthful. Until eventually what? until eventually you want to vomit. And you can't even look at the cake. It's so disgusting. But we forget that part. That's why Buddha calls this level of suffering the suffering of change. There's the kind of suffering where you're starving. That's the gross suffering. It's called the suffering of suffering in the Four Noble Truths. That's the suffering of suffering. And when you get the cake, and that's what we think is happiness. So the suffering is having an empty stomach, and happiness is getting the cake, and is going to get a full stomach. No, because Buddha says it changes. There is definitely some pleasure there. There is some pleasure that's triggered. There's no question. When your tongue and the mouth meet cake, and the stomach is empty, and all the conditions, and a good cake, a whole bunch of conditions come together, there's definitely a delicious experience. No question. Buddha does not argue with that. But what he says we don't notice is that from this first second of that first moment of that first mouthful, and then already the excitement, wanting another piece and wanting another piece and wanting another piece. Why? Because you're not satisfied with that first pleasure. That pleasure is the best, actually. Every moment of pleasure after that first mouthful is now not as good as the first one. But we don't notice because we're hungry and greedy and we're not satisfied with that pleasure and we want to have more pleasure. But what we're not noticing, although we do notice it, but we can't bear to pay attention to it, we can't bear to recognize it, that as you keep having that cake, the pleasure diminishes. And what's coming inexorably is more suffering, the gross suffering, until eventually you want to vomit. The cake, and now how does the cake look now? Utterly disgusting. The same cake that looked divine 5 minutes ago. And I mean, you'd think of any attachment object. This is not meant to be horrible. It's not meant to be depressing. It's scientific fact. Even the most delicious object on the planet, I don't want to get too gross here, but even the most divine body on the planet, which is one we usually think is the most delicious, that triggers the most pleasure. Just think of having contact with that body. I don't want to be too gross. Non-stop. Non-stop. Keep having sex. Keep having it until you will die of disgust and exhaustion. This is a fact. So the point here, what are we trying to prove? What's Buddha trying to prove? He says very simply, logically, if the cake or that divine body are actually the cause of happiness, if they were, then the more contact you had with that boy, the more bliss you'd experience. And the more you put the cake in the mouth, the more pleasure you would get. Everybody's experience scientifically is exactly the opposite, but we can't bear to get the lesson from it. And why? Is because we don't know how else to get pleasure. We don't know how else to get pleasure. That's why this level of suffering the Buddha's describing is so painful to even acknowledge. Because so we're saying to Buddha, what choice have I got? Please give me some, what choice have I got? The only way we know how to trigger pleasure is to have cake and boys. So what choice have I got? He says, well, I've got a method, babies. I've got a method. That's the whole point. But he doesn't say it so simply. We've got to deduce it. He has found a method. This is really true, of how to get happy, how to get pleasant feelings without getting objects. Because his whole teaching about the mind itself, Buddha's whole teaching about the mind itself, its character, what it is, and its potential. Forget enlightenment, forget compassion, forget love, but the natural state of our mind, when it's unencumbered by delusions, even temporarily, is happiness, is pleasure, is joy. This is a fact. So he's even but a billion times more than that, and that's why Lama Yeshe, in his wonderful Mahamudra book, Lama describes some of the benefits of getting single-pointed concentration. Normally the Lamas don't go on about all the delicious qualities because we get all overexcited. But Lama just talks about, he says it's like unbelievable. In our world, it's impossible to imagine the qualities of our mind that we can accomplish just by getting single-pointed concentration. Because when you got single-pointed concentration, this amazing technique these Indians invented before the Buddha, shamatha, because you've accessed the subtler level of your mind, which we don't even posit as existing. You've calmed down the conceptual and the sensory, can cease those completely when you've accomplished the stages of concentration. Then the mind, Lama says some of the qualities. You can't conceive, for example, of the brilliance and the clarity of the mind as if you could count every atom in the universe. You've got absolute, that's just in the concentration. But the crucial one is that you've got naturally unbelievable bliss, joy, rapture, ecstasy, as Lama says. And they mean this literally. So when we hear words like that, it's almost like we're a bit embarrassed. Who gets rapture, for God's sake? Where do you get rapture from? Where do you get bloody ecstasy from? What? Excuse me? Maybe one time, once in a life, some delicious boy might trigger it in your mind for about 3 minutes, then it's all gone, you're asleep again. But this is the Buddha's point is, please hear this, that joy, pleasure, happiness, good feelings on the spectrum of it are the natural state of mind when it's unencumbered by delusions. So this is what he's saying liberation is, finally. And that's just single point of concentration. We've had that in many lives, Buddha says, but we've lost it. So Lama tries to explain in this book, this is the potential of our mind. It gives us some courage to know this is our nature. This is our true nature. So to understand that all Buddha's saying is, first of all, there's gross suffering. In the first noble truth, you've got three. The first one is there is suffering. The second one is there are causes. Third is you can get rid of it. And fourth is how to do it. The first one, he presents three kinds of suffering. The first one is the obvious one, the one that everybody agrees with. When the bad things happen, it's really simple. When the bad things happen, that's it. That we all agree is suffering. And that's what we try to get free of. Then you've got the second level of suffering. This is the one he calls the suffering of change, but what we call happiness. So basically, if you think about the causes, and we've described a bit of attachment, and I haven't begun to really describe it. I will. Why it's deluded. I'm going to get into that. I'm getting into it already. That attachment, for example, when it doesn't get what it wants, that's what's called suffering. The suffering of suffering, when the bad things happen. The bad things happening is when attachment doesn't get what it wants. The second kind of suffering, for us it's called happiness. For Buddha it's called the suffering of change. And that's when attachment gets what it wants. But we think that's happiness. And it is the best we'll get. That's the happiness we get. We don't know any more happiness. Because we're all junkies based upon attachment. This junkie, there's this, it's dissatisfaction, emotional hunger, neediness, manipulation, controlling, expectation, exaggerating. So in other words, we frantically and totally believe when attachment's running the show that boy, that cake, that job, that thing, that house, whatever it might be, when I get that, then I'll get happiness. In other words, we think that's the cause of happiness. It's a trigger, yes. The boy definitely plays a role in that bliss you're experiencing. You can't argue that. The cake definitely plays a role, but they're merely the catalyst. And this is a tragedy with us at the moment, with these gross bodies we've got and these gross minds. We don't know how to have any pleasure, any joy. We don't know how to trigger happy feelings. These are all synonyms without an object. That's being a junkie. That's what samsara is. That's the suffering of attachment. So we're all junkies, Buddha says. The degree that we have any attachment, that degree we're a junkie. That's a fact. That's how he talks, He doesn't use those words, obviously. So attachment running the show is the nightmare. It just increases the suffering, increases the dissatisfaction, increases the emotional hunger. It not only do you end up with pleasure, not only do you not end up with pleasure when you get the cake, not only do you not end up with pleasure when you got the cake, you end up with gross suffering again. And not only that, you don't alleviate the suffering at all. You increase the craving to get more. So it's a bottomless pit. Now we know it, but because we don't have any, this is my feeling, we don't have any options. If we could see options, would we not try them? Well, Buddha's giving us an option. Here's my method how to get happy, babe. This is his whole entire point, but we can't hear it. It sounds like religion and it sounds forbidding and you've got to give up everything and walk around with a long face. Who wants that kind of happiness? Because we can't hear it. So he's a practical man, it's practical. This is not religion, it's practical. This is not belief, this is practical. This is psychology, this is doable. It's just a hard job giving up being a junkie, that's all. 7:30. 7:30, wherever you are in India. What's India? 8 o'clock nearly. So some questions, come on. Please have some questions for me. The last 30 minutes, 40 minutes. Any questions? I'm happy to keep chatting, I promise.
I have a question.
Who's I? Where are you?
Hello.
I can find you. Hello, sweetheart.
I'm
Yes. Sure, darling. In Brazil. Go on then. Talk to me.
A friend, maybe it's a stupid question, but I've had this in my mind. A friend of mine this morning said to me, it's not possible to reach anything, to reach freedom or enlightenment or awakening if you don't get rid of the ego. And she asked me to define ego according to my Buddhist view, and I couldn't do it.
Okay, let's talk about it.
Please.
Okay, good, Anugrah. So I mean, we use that word very loosely. I mean, let's face it. Look, I think, wasn't it Mr. Freud who first started talking about it? It's just a Greek word for I, for a start. We'd love to use Greek. Every time we have any fancy words in our science, we use Greek. It makes it sound fancy. I don't know why. It just means I. So, we say it, what we mean when we say ego, we mean naughty I, when it's all kind of puffed up and important and attachment and anger. So it's a very general term we're using rather loosely for when the delusions, I would say it's when the delusions are running the show. That's how we talk about ego. So she's absolutely right. But what that means more strictly, more correctly, if we look at these 3 root delusions, the ego grasping, the root one, the ignorance that believes in the intrinsic me. She's absolutely right. That's when you've uprooted that one, when you've realized emptiness, that means when you've cut that one, that's when you've achieved, when you begin to achieve liberation. So she's right. But we have to start with the branch delusions first, because that's more subtle. So that's why we have to look at attachment first. That's the main voice of ego grasping. And then aversion is the response when attachment doesn't get what it wants. There's this hierarchical relationship. So yes, we have to get rid of ego grasping. We have to realize emptiness. We have to see the fantasy I that we think is there isn't. That is when we begin to get liberation. So she's right. But we use the word very loosely, I'd say. The word, because technically it means simply I. And so if you're speaking in Tibetan or in Sanskrit, you wouldn't talk like that. Are we communicating or not? Yes? Okay, darling. Good.
Anybody yes, thank else? You very much.
Okay, sweetheart. Anybody else got a question? Huh. I'm happy to keep talking. Let's keep talking about attachment. We've got to. Okay. On my screen, I have me. Is that what because you put me there, is it? Is that right, Jennifer? I'm looking at my whole face. I like to see all of you, but so if I click that, does that change your screens as well? What do you no, do you all what do you all see now?
We just see you.
Oh God, okay, then I can see everybody. Thank you very much. That's a great relief. Okay. So attachment. Without understanding attachment, we can't be Buddhists. Without understanding attachment, we just don't know how we can't work out our own mind. It's a fact, because attachment is there. You could say it's there all the time. It's just there. It's like this motor that drives us. So we really learn to understand attachment more deeply when we talk about, in the Mahayana path, in the transforming problems level of teachings. We learn about the 8 worldly Dharmas, this really kind of strange phrase. I know when I first heard it, I thought, what are these lamas talking about, Or it comes back to the Indians. But basically, it's a more primordial way of understanding attachment. In the middle scope, when we look at, or in the high school, like I call it, when we start to learn about the delusions, you learn low rig, you learn about the mind. You just learn about you learn about attachment, and the main level of practice in the wisdom wing at that first stage of practice is mainly to kind of control attachment to the sense objects. That's the grossest level. In the very first level of practice, we just have to control the senses themselves. We control our body and our speech. We don't even look at our mind much yet. When we get to high school, we start to learn the mind, and now we have to control our attachment in relation to the cakes and the boys and the beer and all the external ones. But when we start to understand attachment more primordially, which is certainly when we get to the Bodhisattva path, then we'll realize it's much more pervasive. So really the way to talk about attachment, it's really at the level of assumption in our mind. It's an assumption, a deep primordial assumption. And that's why we just don't notice it and can't pay attention to it, because it's just a given to us. And it's the assumption that I must get what I want every millisecond. That's literally the assumption of attachment. So obviously, the millisecond it doesn't get it. You drop the cup when you're washing the dishes, the loud noise, the irritating something, the wrong thing, mild baby things all day. Then that's what annoyance is, frustration, upset, irritated. The second that assumption of getting what I want is thwarted, then aversion arises. Instantly, that very instant. So we're running between attachment and aversion 1,000 times a day, mostly at a mild level. So we don't pay attention. This is our problem. We only pay attention when you become a junkie. We only pay attention when you want to kill somebody. Then you think you've got a problem, because we're not paying attention at a deeper level. This is where we have to start practicing. So this 8 worldly Dharmas is this weird 4 pairs, So there's the attachment. The first lot is this assumption, this constant craving for happy feelings. And this seems so obvious, but of course I want happy feelings. Of course I want happy feelings, we'll say. But we've got to analyze attachment, analyze the assumption, this false assumption, this junkie in us. So attachment works like this. Every second you get pleasant feelings, which is called happiness, another word for happiness. This is an important point. When we talk about happiness or suffering, because we're so addicted to believing the external is the cause, that we think that happiness is the external. So tell me about your happiness, Robina, and I'll describe my handsome boyfriend. I'll describe the delicious cake. I'll describe the lovely day at the beach. Because we actually think the external is the happiness. When you remember happiness, you remember the event. That's demented. Happiness is in the mind. In this model of the mind, where we describe the 3 categories of states of mind, the neurotic negative ones, the valid positive ones, and the third ones, the mechanics, I call. Feeling, there's one called feeling in there, and it means it's not a negative state of mind, and it's not a positive state of mind. And that's very distinct, again, that use of those words. So there's only 3 kinds of feeling we'll ever have. It's not equivalent to what we mean by an emotion. It's a technical thing. A feeling, you either have a pleasant feeling, an unpleasant feeling, or a neutral feeling. That's it. But of course, you can have a spectrum of mildly pleasant to rapture. You can have a spectrum of mildly annoying to the most intense agony on the planet. It's clear. Forget the neutral ones. The pleasant and unpleasant, they're our concern. Because pleasant is another word. Pleasant feelings is another word for happiness. Happiness is not a physical experience. We can experience through our sensory consciousness. And happiness is not an event. It's a moment in the mind. It's a pleasant feeling. It's a pleasant feeling. Unhappiness is an unpleasant feeling, and it's neither good nor bad. It's just what it is. But our trouble, first of all, because when we hear pleasure, or if you hear rapture, we feel kind of guilty. That sounds a bit like a sin, Can't have that. Ecstasy, oh no. Even very happy feelings, we get a bit nervous, But it's nothing wrong. It's perfectly fine. So attachment is not happiness. Happiness is not attachment. Attachment is a state of mind under the negative states of mind, and pleasant feelings is under the neutral state of mind. They're completely separate states of mind. But we link them, because attachment is the part of our mind, the junkie, the craving, the junkie that is looking for the object, such that when we have contact with it, pleasure is triggered. So there's nothing wrong with pleasure. As Lama Yeshe would say, more pleasure the better, dear. But we get nervous. So Buddha's whole point is you'll end up with such a blissful mind, you won't believe it. Because he doesn't say it like that. In other words, we think happiness, good feelings, pleasant feelings, joy, ecstasy, rapture are what we get when we get what attachment wants. That's the methodology of samsara. No, Buddha says, you got it wrong, babe. Happy feelings, rapture, ecstasy are what you end up with naturally in your mind when you've given up attachment. That's what Buddha's telling us. That's it. But we can do more than that. We can actually achieve liberation. We can cut ego grasping. We can realize emptiness. We can have bodhicitta as well. They're all extra. But this is the fundamental point the Buddha's making, So to hear this in a rational way, it gets us a bit enthusiastic. But we hear it in a moralistic way, because we conflate attachment and happiness. That's why when you get really fundamentalist religious, look at all the fundamentalist religious people, Any religion, Buddhism as well. You end up becoming miserable. You got to suffer because we just can't hear it, So attachment is this assumption that the fantasy I that doesn't exist, must get what it wants every millisecond. That's what drives, and even right now when we're even nice people, we have virtue, kindness, love, compassion. They're our saving grace. They are the ones that's why we're not completely a psychotic. That's why we're not some terrorist and rapist and murderer, who's completely driven mainly by delusions. Ours are maybe a little bit not so bad. We don't run around raping and killing too many people. But when we understand our mind more deeply, we're going to see that we're driven by these. And that's why we have any worry. That's why we have any suffering at all. Anxiety, fears, depression, anxiety, can't cope with this, looking at the panic of this and worry about this and seeing suffering out there. That's not because of the suffering. It's not because of the bad things happening. It's because of our attachment, not getting what it wants. It arises as aversion, as panic, as worry, as fear. So attachment is an assumption that I must get what I want every millisecond. And when it doesn't, 1,000 times a day, that instant is what aversion arises. And then depending on your mind, your personality, how strong the aversion is. But we have all the time constant episodes of annoyed, irritated, frustrated, upset. And sometimes we can just feel that way all the time. These are our main suffering, day to day. Attachment and aversion. So we have to have, so in order to understand the Buddhist one, we have to have this analysis and know that these are the problem, not the external. COVID-19 and all the problems out there and the rapist husband and this and that are not the problem. I mean, I know it sounds ridiculous to put it that way. Of course they're a problem. But it's our response to the problem. That's the key. And that's why I love always using examples of my friends in prison. Because their backs are against the wall. They can change nothing outside. Their hands are tied. But they know, the ones I know over the years who've written to us, and when I was working for the prison project, I still have friends in prison, and they take the Buddhist techniques really seriously because they do not have a choice. But they know they can change their mind. That's Buddha's skill. We can change our mind. And so what happens when you change your mind? Well, as Lama Zopa said, which is shocking for our view, if you don't feel abused, if you don't interpret it as abuse, then where is the abuse? I'm not talking about suppressing things. I'm talking about a person who's practiced. Then it's water off a duck's back. We can't cope with that in our psychology. It sounds like you're demanding that people become victims. No, they're literally the opposite, It's very shocking to hear this. But this is the point Buddha's making. We can change the mind. He says, if you can change something, please change it. Don't sit there and be miserable. Change the damn thing. Chuck out your bloody old husband if he's horrible. If you can do that, great. But what if you can't? Then you change your mind, babe. But that's where we go crazy. And half the time we can't even do either. Our problem is we're such victim mentality, so stuck in our own misery that, you're at work and you hate your boss, you hate the job, you go home every day miserable, you go to work every day miserable. Well, basically you could change your job, Robina. No, I couldn't do that. I'll never get another job. No, it's impossible. The job market's bad. I'll never get any money. I'll be left on the street. Can't do it. Okay, then, you've decided to keep in the job, have you? You've decided to stay in the job, yes. Well, you can change your mind about it. No, I can't do that. It's still miserable. So we're paralyzed. We can't even change our job, and we can't change our attitude towards the job. Well, you've got to make up your mind. There's only two options. So talk about victim. We are all like that, Stuck in our misery. Too scared to leave the crummy husband, but also can't change your mind about your husband. I mean, this is powerful practice. You can decide that your boyfriend's worthwhile. You can decide there's something worthwhile here. We've got something to work together. There's something good about this. But you can decide that. So you make a choice. I'm going to stay with this guy. Then you work on your mind. But the victim one is, oh no, I'm not, I remember hearing Oprah recently say, Oprah, the American Oprah they say, Oprah. She said one of the commonest things she hears from women is, he's better than nothing, or what you've got is better than having nothing. This hopelessness, this victim mentality. This is so common. This is not criticizing us. This is why we all suffer. We don't have any sense that we have any choice about anything. We can't change the husband, and we can't change our attitude towards the husband. So what do? We live in hell. This is how we are. That's the misery of, that's our misery. We might as well be in prison. I know there's a book that's just coming out now. We're doing a special fundraiser for it. We're doing a website. It's a book, Lama Zopa asked me to put together all his letters to prisoners. Over the years, we're running the prison project, and still now since I left 10 years ago, people write to him, prisoners write to him, And he writes, he's incredibly kind how he writes letters. One guy got a 45-page letter, 45-page typed letter, from Lama Zopa. It's like an entire book. Details about emptiness, details about attachment. Unbelievable, so kind. So all the letters, we put them together as a book, not like letters, but as a coherent narrative, And of course, there's radical teachings he gives to these prisoners. And as one of his commonest themes is, I remember the very first prisoner who ever wrote to him Arturo, this very first person who wrote to us back in the very beginning, 95 or something. And he wrote to Lama Zopa asking for spiritual advice. And he told him, and there's Arturo in his own cell, 23 hours a day, this young Mexican guy, since he's 12, since he's 11 in gangs, since 12 he's been in prison, and then since 16 he was given a life sentence. There's 3 life sentences. He didn't kill anybody, just the sentencing is so severe. It was. They're trying to change it now in California. And and he's in his own cell 23 hours a day because he was in the gangs, you know. In the gangs, you have to fight. That's what you do. So anyway, Lama Zopa said to him, your prison is nothing in comparison with the inner prison of ordinary people. So on the face of it, it sounds shocking to say that. But this is the Buddhist understanding. That's his theme all the time. And look at our suffering. Look at our utter misery. The fears, the drama, the expectations, the worries, the hopelessness, low self-esteem, self-loathing, depression, can't cope, don't know what life's all about, what am I going to do? Even though if we tick the boxes, we're living in a paradise in comparison with a prisoner. But we know the internal prison's worse. We all know it if we look. We all know you can have the richest, most divine-looking person on the planet with enough money to sink a ship and they completely want to kill themselves. We know this. And I can tell you some of my friends in prison. My friend Mitchell on death row in Kentucky. He's been there 30 years. Him and his friend Leaf, they're both in the same prison. They're mates. And Leaf's now a very devoted Catholic. I've known Mitch for 20 years. He's a Buddhist. And they were in a gang, not even in gangs. They're these white Southern boys, and they had drugs. And when you have drugs, you have guns. And if you have guns, people die. I'm sorry, you know. So people died. They're not psychopaths. So they got on death row. So he's getting close to his death date. And but he's just this happy guy, happy, wonderful fellow. He's completely content. He gets up at 4 a.m, does 2 hours of practice. You know, he's just this happy human being. He's funny. He cracks jokes. He's a happy guy living in his red jumpsuit with all his death row friends. You know, expecting to get electrocuted any moment. The last talk when I met him last year, when I went to see him last year, I talk on the phone to him and write letters and things. And he was trying to work out how was best to when they come to kill him. He was sentenced in the 80s when they electrocuted people, and that's now illegal. But because he was sentenced in the 80s, he has to be electrocuted. So it's got to be, this person's going to come up to him and describe that exactly, you know. They're going to wire his entire body and then put a sponge on his head and put a cloth over his face, and then they put him in the chair and tie him up and they turn him on, you know, and then they fry him to death. So he said how he was trying to think about how would it be best to think while he's there with this guy 1 inch from his face, you know. Should I think of him and have compassion for him? I said, that's good, yeah, but maybe let him do his job, you know. Don't worry about him. Just focus on your practice. He's very devoted. He does all his practices. He did Lama Chopa for him. He didn't have a clue what he was doing, but he loves doing these practices, you know. He does Vajrasattva. He does the different practices. I said, just focus on your own mind. That's the best way, you know. So that's his reality, but he's a happy man. He's a happy man for sure. There's no question. He's a grandfather now. He makes little things for people. He writes letters to people. He's worked on his mind. He doesn't go on about the suffering of a hopeless. I mean, I know these places are garbage dumps, you know. I've been there. He never talks about it, never complains, never asks for anything, never. Has his red jumpsuit, has a few possessions, that's it, you know. Always happy, because he's worked on his mind. I'm not trying to make him a saint, but he's worked on his mind because he doesn't have a choice. He lives with some psychopaths. Yeah, there are probably more psychopaths out of prison than in prison, I'm quite sure. But there's one of his friends, I know this guy, you know. Anyways, no, it doesn't matter about that. So attachment, giving up expectations, giving up craving, giving up, you know, wanting what I want every second. So these 8 worldly dharmas, I was going to say in more detail. There's the first pair. There's 4 pairs in the way attachment works, and basically this first one, which is the most primordial, that covers everything, and it's this constant assumption that I must have only pleasant feelings. And then, how this attachment works is the millisecond an unpleasant feeling comes, attachment shifts from wanting pleasant feelings to wanting to be free from unpleasant feelings. In other words, attachment never ceases. So I always remember one example. Just one example that struck me when I was at one of our centres in Australia, and it's about a 3-minute walk from the Gompa to my room, and it's very cold there. It's a teacher centre. It's near Bendigo, near Melbourne, and it's very windy and cold in the winter. So you know what it's like when you're in a warm room and you're all cozy. Your attachment's getting what it wants, so you're kind of relaxed. Then you open that door and you walk outside and the cold air hits you. Or even here this morning, I mean, it gets very chilly here in Santa Fe. It's high up in the mountain, sort of high up, you know. It's like 2 degrees Celsius. So I'm in a warm, cozy house. I've got a lovely, cozy house with nice heating in the floor. It's so luxurious, I can't tell you. I've got silent AC up there when it gets too hot. I mean, but we just take all these for granted. So my attachment can get what it wants every second. But the second I walk out that door, we know that. And I was going to say, when I was at Tatisa Center, a 3-minute walk to my room. First of all, attachment's getting what it wants, so you're all complacent. You open the door, you hit the cold air. Attachment now shifts to waiting for, anticipating, expecting to be free of that unhappy feeling. Now that's where, when you start to think of suffering, when I start to think of pain, people who live in pain all the time, I can't even imagine that nightmare. I can imagine how you'd think you'd want to kill yourself, because your attachment is only wanting to be free of that pain. And that's why we suffer. This seems very hard to hear, but that's why we suffer, because aversion is resisting reality. Aversion is denying the reality of that bad thing. Aversion or anger is wishing it wasn't there. So we think that's natural. It is, but it's a complete gross delusion. We can learn to give up expecting delicious things, and we can learn to give up wanting to be free of undelicious things. This is the nightmare of how attachment pervades every second of our life, but we think it's normal and we don't ever look at it. This is when we really start to practice. In other words, it's transforming problems into happiness. What that literally means is, when you walk out the door and you're hit by the cold, you change your view of it. You literally see it as good. You welcome it. That's how we live day-to-day life. That's how we can live day-to-day life, and then we won't go mad. We can't stop the nightmarish politics. We can't stop these crazy people. We can't stop the violence. We can do what we can to help it. But the suffering we experience in relation to that violence and the lousy politics or whatever it might be is the resistance of it, the aversion to it, the wishing it wasn't there. That is what causes the pain. And we can change that view. That's what my friend Mitchell has done in prison. He sees his shitty place where he's staying. You know, and boiling hot in the summer, freezing cold in the winter, not very pleasant company, some of them, disgusting food, treated like an animal. He's the lowest of the lowest in the whole of American society, a person on death row. He read an article in the local paper about one of his latest appeals was denied. And he was reading an article about this monster on death row, and it dawned on him they were talking about him. So to have that kind of view of people think you're a monster, he's not a monster, I promise you. He did a bad thing, but he's transformed himself. But people don't like to think that in this country. You've got to be a monster till you die. He was shocked to hear he suddenly saw his name. It was shocking to him. So to have the worst reputation on the planet in this country, to be on death row, an evil person, to have a shitty life, crummy clothes, no good food, no contact with your family for 30 years, and going to be ended up electrocuted very soon. And he's a happy guy. So, I mean, it's possible. Anything's possible. Changing our mind, changing our view. And stop being fatalistic. It doesn't mean you don't try and stop. He doesn't try and stop. He hasn't stopped doing his appeals. He does his best. But he's got a happy mind, and he helps others. He's kind, compassionate, takes care of people. They all love him on death row. He's their friend. You know, he looks after people, the wackos. He's a happy guy. Why? Because he's given up attachment and he's given up anger. To some degree, that's happiness. That's what happiness is. That's it. Not complicated. So no, I'm very inspired by my friends in prison, you know. I mean, I can get exactly what I want. I've got this heating on my phone. I've got everything. I just press a button, I get cool. Press a button, I get heat. Press a button, I get an espresso. Press a button, I get everything I want every second. You can't waste it. It's so shocking, you know. It's attachment and aversion. That's it. When we understand these two, all the others fall into place. I swear. 10-2. I've talked the whole time. Come on. You have to ask me some questions now. I'm sure we're communicating, and I'm sure every single one of you recognizes what I'm saying, yeah? because it's human nature. It's, that's his Buddha's expertise. He sees his own mind and he says, honey, you've got to find yours is the same. We're all variations, we're all the variation of the same recipe, but with different quantities, more attachment, more this, more that, more this, but we all got the same mental illnesses. And Buddha would mean that, whether you're a psychopath, whether you're Mr. Trump, whether you're Hitler, there's karma and your past actions and then your mind. And this is the model that suits all beings in the universe, and not even just humans, but animals as well, and all the others.
I don't know. Can I ask you another question?
You certainly can. But I can manage. I can wait. Go on. Yeah, ask me another question, darling. Go on.
So,
I'm listening.
I've heard you talking about attachment, aversion, and so and so. And all the masters, all the big masters, the small masters, they do the same. So why we don't change? Why? What is needed for us to change? Because I can understand.
Don't be ridiculous. Shh. It's easy to understand. Come on. It's easy to understand.
Yeah.
It's easy to understand. Why is particular characteristic, what is a particular characteristic, why is it strong in us? It's because that's more strong than the other. That's all. It's because you've done that more than the others. It's not complicated. You are changing. Don't set yourself in stone. It just takes time. But it's so obvious. If you've played piano for 27 years, it's easy to play piano. Would you agree it's easy? Would you agree it's easy if you've practiced for 27 years?
Yes, sure.
Well, then obviously, if anger is easy for you, it's obvious you've practiced anger. If love is more easy for you, if generosity is easy for you, that shows you what you've practiced. If more roses in your garden than weeds, it's obvious what you've grown. You've grown the roses. If your weeds are more prevailing in your garden, it's obvious you've grown the weeds. So it's not complicated. It's because whatever is more easy in you is what you've practiced. So you've got to make a decision what you want to practice. So you have to change your habits. That's why it takes time. It's normal. Nothing special. Do you understand me?
Yes, I do.
That's it.
I do.
So just keep
Thank you so
persevering.
much.
Just persevere. Practice. We know practice makes perfect. But Tibetans have a wonderful way of putting it. They say nothing gets more difficult with practice. So it's a very optimistic way of putting it, What else, people?
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
Good. What else, people? Somebody else? Any old question? We'll have to talk about emptiness another day. No other questions?
I've got a question.
Good, Bogdan. You go for it.
So yesterday I was at the train station with a friend, and then there are like those homeless people running around and begging for money. And I wasn't really sure how to deal with that situation. And I was thinking like, okay, do I give them money now? But then in the back of my mind, knowing they will probably get drugs around the corner. And then I was like, okay, what is the best thing to do in this kind of situation?
I understand. I mean, you've got to take it on a one at a time basis. You've got to use your wisdom. But there's different approaches, I think, Bogdan. For example, if there's a particular person here, I'm in Santa Fe, and we went out for dinner one night, and the people who live here, there's this one woman, they've known her for 20 years. She's homeless, and they know that she lies continuously, she manipulates people. They know that from experience. They're not criticizing, they're facts. So they decided they would not give her money. They just decided that. So I don't know the woman, so I gave her some money. So they had some information, but not out of a vindictiveness, but they made a decision they wouldn't give her money. I mean, that's their decision. But I just decided, it depends. For me, the practice of generosity to homeless people has always been a practice I think it's really important to practice. Because you don't like to give to homeless people. You have all these reasons. It might well be true that you do that. But there's another whole approach to it. If you think of generosity, it's a very powerful practice in itself for one's own benefit to learn to open our heart, and whoever wants something within limits, just to give them what they want. There's nothing wrong with that, Bogdan. It's a practice for you as much as anything. Do you understand?
Okay.
So if you have knowledge that makes it, that you realize it's not worthwhile, then you make your decision. But it's always got to be done on the basis of a positive motivation. So when I lived in San Francisco back, 15 years ago, and I'd walk out in the evenings. I'd guarantee I'd meet homeless people. When you're in India, you know, when in Bodhgaya, especially on the holy days, you're going to line up and have 4,000 beggars lining up waiting for their money. So Tibetans know this, so they get their rupees out in advance, and then they give what they can, and then when you run out, you stop. So that's what a view I had when I lived in San Francisco. So I'd get out my 5s and my 10s, and I really mean this. I made a decision, not bloody $1, not 50 cents. That's just 50 years ago, 50 cents was useful, you know. But so I decided that's my practice. So even though the guys who were coming up when half naked, drugged out of their brains, it wasn't my job to decide what they do with their money. I decided I would give them money until I ran out. It's a good practice for me, you know. And they might have bought a sandwich with it, but that's not my job. It's a bit like if you have a job and you have a boss, and you basically, the boss agrees that if you do the job they want, they'll give you money. But can you imagine how outraged you'd be if they gave you the money but said, don't buy drugs and don't buy guns and don't buy prostitutes, then I'll pay you. You would sue them to mind their own business. So in a way, it's a contract with a homeless person. They walk up to you, you can speculate what they'll do with it, but that's not your business. Just give. But at other times, use your wisdom and maybe don't give sometimes. But either way, it's got to be based on wisdom and compassion. Otherwise, it's just self-centered, mean. And the gut feeling is we don't want. I walk into Starbucks and I'm happy to pay my $10 for a cake and a coffee. And I come outside and I don't even want to give $1 to this smelly guy. It's just an automatic feeling we have, you know, like he doesn't, because we don't mind giving money if we get something for it. And even we don't, and analyze it. When I give my $10 to Starbucks, probably 40% is pure profit. So in a sense, I'm giving a donation to Starbucks of $4. But I don't mind doing that because that's called commerce and we all accept it. So it's up to how you analyze it, you know. And generosity is a very powerful practice. Just to give with an open heart is very important practice. Do you understand, Bogdan?
I do,
Okay.
yes. Thank you very much.
Good, okay. And I know for myself, because I'm a Buddhist nun, I live on donations. I don't technically get a salary, but I don't expect donations. I don't ask for them. I don't bill people, but I get donations. So if I'm living on donations, I had better continue to share my donations, excuse me. I mean, we all should think that way about money. You know, we should try and be generous. It's very powerful practice. Time to go home.
Hello,
Who's that?
Anila.
Yeah, who is it?
I have a question. Thank.
Where are you? Yes, talk to me.
Thank.
Yes, please.
Hi.
Hi there.
Since we're talking about attachments and aversions and everything, I think one of the practice that we were told to do is the Tonglen, the giving and taking.
That's right,
meditation.
exactly. Yes.
And we imagine taking others' sufferings, others' bad things, and then in return we give away the good thing. But we always have this sense of forcing ourselves to take the sufferings of others, taking away the bad thing, and why we are thinking like, why do I have to do this? Why do I have to take their suffering? I myself are doing good things, so why do I have to? So there's this sense of forcing myself.
I understand,
to do
Teng.
this. So I wonder if you have a better ways of doing this meditation.
I understand, Teng.
Without feeling, yeah.
I understand very clearly. So this is where, Teng, it's so important, as you know, to realize we look at this whole Lam Rim, it's all these different levels of practice, and they're levels according to our capacity. Do you understand that? We have to realize that. You know, I always use this example, as you know. If you're studying mathematics, you have to know what level you're at, don't you? You can't just leap in and start studying grade 12 math if you haven't done grade 6. We have to know our own capacity. This is really important, and we often don't understand spiritual practices like that. So Tonglen is the most advanced of the practices to achieve bodhicitta, which is the most advanced level of the practice. That's university level. That's the highly developed level. So what we have to understand in all those practices, and Tonglen is the perfect example, what the person, the attitude to have is that you want, because you've got so much compassion, you want the most intense experiences that will smash your delusions, because when you smash your delusions, then you will get more compassion and you'll be able to become a Buddha to benefit others. So it's a bit like, you know, if you like a nice day on your bicycle, you'll like to ride downhill and maybe on the straight paths, but you don't want to go uphill. It's too exhausting. Are you kind of hearing me? You don't have to stress yourself going uphill, but the fanatic cyclists, they prefer this uphill because they want to push against all the rubbish inside themselves, and they want to become the best cyclist in the world. Well, these bodhisattvas want to become the best Buddha in the world, and the quickest way to become a Buddha is smash your delusions. So the quickest way to smash your delusions is to want, you would rather have the suffering than that person. In other words, it's just, I'm making it more complicated, but basically the attitude is that you've got such you want to try and cultivate the idea that you have such compassion for this person, you even would rather have the pain than them. I mean, I hear parents talk this way. I wish I could have the pain of my child. So really, it's a powerful kind of compassion. So the reason you would want to do it is so that you smash ego grasping. That's the reason. And why do you want to smash ego grasping? Because that causes you suffering, and that will then prevent you from becoming a Buddha. So it's a very powerful, brave attitude. But as Pabonka Rinpoche says, you've got to be a suitable vessel for this kind of practice. If we're not ready for that kind of practice, then we don't do it. But the attitude, see, so it's really important, and that's why your question's so good. It's important to understand why you're trying to do it. The only reason you want to think, I would rather have the suffering than that person, is because you're trying to cultivate that level of compassion. That level of compassion is so incredible. So of course we haven't got it now. That's why we have to practice it. So you've got to understand, you're not trying to get a headache. You're not trying to become miserable. You know, none of that's the reason. Is you're trying to have the courage to think that if I could, I would rather have the headache than this person. So it's trying to cultivate very powerful compassion. But if it doesn't make sense, don't do it. There's no point in doing it with the wrong attitude. It doesn't make sense. Can you understand at all what I'm saying?
So I mean, over time, with better practice,
well, of course, yeah, but it's important you know why you're doing it, not just to become kind of martyr, you know? Like you just said, I'm a good person anyway.
Because we will introduce this practice when we do the November course in Kopang.
Yeah, that's right.
So
always, yeah. But
so I thought it was the preliminary practice, you know.
No, on the contrary, it's not a preliminary practice. It's an advanced practice, and you'd only hear it because in the Lam Rim in the November course, you learn about the Bodhisattva path, and that's in the Bodhisattva path, and the Bodhisattva path is university level. The very first level is, you know, if I'm in a relationship with you, let's say I'm in a relationship with my boyfriend, and I'm a victim, and he's brutal, and he's abusive, and he's angry with me, and I'm afraid, and I'm scared, and that's not my practice. That would be the wrong practice for me. Do you understand? My practice is to have enough courage to walk out of the relationship. So we've got to know where we're at in what we're capable of. This is not a preliminary. It's a most advanced practice. You with me?
Yep.
Good. Thank you very much, team. Thank you. Okay, you people. 8:30 on my clock. So I've got all these clocks. And I'll see the Indian clock, and it's 8:32. So... and it's 8:02.
Is there still room for another question?
Yeah, of course there is. Go on. No hesitating.
Okay. So the example of the cake you gave, did I understand it correctly that you said that the pleasant feeling that you get from the cake is not the problem?
That's right. It's not.
Okay. So
but hang on. But because we're junkies, for the problem, for the pleasure, we can't resist, and that's why we end up hurting people. So attachment is the problem. Pleasure's not the problem. Attachment is the problem. The junkie mind is the problem, and the junkie mind thinks that the only way to get pleasure is to get the cake. So we make a big mess. That's the problem. So go on.
Okay. So the question was, how does this pleasant experience arise? Does it arise because I impose certain characteristics onto the object, or does it naturally arise?
No, it's a really good point. It's a really good question. If we just had pure consciousness, like when you've got single-pointed concentration, Bogdan, you've gone beyond the body, you've gone beyond the senses, you've gone beyond the conceptuality. If you can try and conceptualize that, imagine that. We've got these subtle levels of mind. So when you've gone beyond the gross sensory objects, the gross senses, the body, when you've gone beyond the body to this subtler level of mind, then it's naturally blissful. It's just its nature. Are you hearing that point? It's just natural. So, because our mind, which is not physical, is joined up with this bag of bones, this body is very gross. So, and because of addiction over centuries and over countless lifetimes of attachment, we've gotten into the habit. The only way we can access our pleasure in our mind is by having having an object that the senses can contact. The senses is the mind. The mind is there, but we can't activate that pleasure until we get the object that triggers it. So it is a natural part of our mind, but we have to get the object to trigger it. Whereas when you're in concentration or you've given up delusions, your mind is naturally blissful. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, I understood it. Yeah.
So basically, we're just at the level of being a junkie. Very gross level. The only way we can trigger any pleasant feelings, and we all want pleasant feelings, there's no question, that's what drives everything. The only way we can get those pleasant feelings, it is in our mind that does experience them, but the body is very deadening, the body is very gross. So we have to have an object that triggers it. But much of the reason, it's also very fascinating, if you know, that it's how you perceive, and that's the real one about emptiness. You know, in this letter to this prisoner, Rinpoche in great detail about how it's if you view that shape, if you like girls and you see this girl shape, and because of strong karmic habit with seeing girls as a pleasant shape, you've called it pleasant. You've made up from much familiarity that shape of a person is what you think is delicious. Do you understand? And that is made up by the mind, and that is what triggers the pleasure. So when you give up on that girl and you can't stand that girl anymore, her body's still the same, but look how you see her body now, so there's no pleasure whatsoever. And that's a very powerful one, I think, about, especially about men, because men, you have this kind of, I don't know, I always get too personal, I have to be careful how I talk. Men really believe, we all believe, we all believe that pleasure is, that sexual pleasure is a physical thing, especially, we all think that, but it's not physical. It's literally the way you label that cake, the way you label a